the hormones of the posterior pituitary, which is the posterior part of the pituitary gland, which is this region here. And then we'll talk about the anterior gland in the next slide. So the hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are actually called neurohormones because these are hormones that are secreted from neurons instead of from the gland itself. So the posterior pituitary is actually very unique. It's made from different tissue than the anterior pituitary. And so we see that there are nerve endings that are coming from the hypothalamus here. So this is the hypothalamus. These are the cells that are controlling the release of these neurons. So basically we can see that the somas or the cell bodies of these neurons are located up in the hypothalamus. The axons stretch all the way through the infundibulum and then down into the posterior pituitary. And then the axon terminals of these neurons are in the posterior pituitary, where the release of these hormones takes place into the capillary beds. So it's actually more correct to say that the posterior pituitary releases certain hormones instead of secretes certain hormones, because the secretion is really taking place in the hypothalamus. The release is taking place down here in the pituitary, the posterior pituitary. So the two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are ADH, which is also called antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin. Those three terms are interchangeable. And then oxytocin is the second hormone that is released here as well. Now, the function of ADH is to control our water balance. It's going to prevent diuresis or prevent loss of water from the kidneys. So although it's secreted in the hypothalamus, released in the posterior pituitary, its function is actually further down in the body. It's going to be in the kidneys. And it's secreted specifically from the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. So up in the hypothalamus, we have different nuclei, and specifically the neurons that are involved with the paraventricular nucleus are the ones that are secreting ADH, which can be released and released from the posterior pituitary. The second hormone that is released from the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is going to be secreted from the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. So it's all in the hypothalamus, but this is a different group of neurons or a different group of cells that are secreting this different hormone. And then it will also be converted or released from the posterior pituitary by the axons of these neurons that stretch through the infundibulum and down into the pituitary. The function of oxytocin is going to be to control ejection of milk from the mammary gland. So this is going to be released especially around postpartum, especially around birth or pregnancy, and it's going to control the letdown or the injection of milk. Now, I want you to make a note that this is not the secretion or the production of milk. This is simply the ejection of milk. There's another hormone that we're going to talk about that controls the production of milk in the mammary glands, whereas oxytocin is controlling the letdown or the ejection or the release of that milk. Okay. All right, so this brings us to speak about tropic hormones. Now, tropic hormones are hormones that are released or secreted, and they control the secretion of another hormone. And so these can be thought of as primary hormones because their release is going to control another hormonal release. And hence we call them tropic or trophic hormones. Now these can be stimulating other hormone release, or they can also be inhibiting other hormone release. And so when we speak about the different trophic hormones that we'll touch on in the next packet, we're going to point out specifically whether or not they're encouraging the pituitary to release a hormone, or they are inhibiting the pituitary from releasing a hormone. Okay. We can also speak about the portal system that is involved with the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary also falls under this unique type of blood flow that we call a portal system. Now, the portal system is not unique to the pituitary. We see it other places in the body, but basically this is a flow where we have two capillary beds before we get back to the heart. So typically, the normal flow of our vasculature goes from the heart out to an artery, then to a capillary bed, and then to an organ or gland or tissue, and then back to the heart. Now, in a portal system, blood flow is going to encounter two capillary beds before it goes back to the heart. So we've got blood that's coming from the heart. It's going to enter this vessel shown here in red, this artery. It's going to go to the hypothalamus. It's going to go to a capillary bed, which is shown here in purple. But instead of going back to the heart at this point, it's going to go to another organ, which is the anterior pituitary, and then it's going to go to a vein, and then it's going to go back to the heart. Now, the purpose of having a portal system here in the anterior pituitary is so that the hormones that are released in the hypothalamus can be sent in this secondary capillary bed down to the anterior pituitary, and then they can be released into the blood. So the reason that we have this two capillary bed communication is to pick up those hormones from the hypothalamus, send them to the anterior pituitary, and then they can be released into the blood. So the big picture here that I want to kind of summarize is that the posterior pituitary gets its communication from the hypothalamus through neurons or through nerves. The anterior pituitary gets its communication from the hypothalamus through the vasculature system, through this unique portal type of blood flow. Okay. All right. So this kind of describes that portal circulation that I was talking about. So the blood that has these various tropic hormones, now there are several different tropic hormones that are being released from the hypothalamus, is going to be sent via that blood down to the anterior pituitary specifically. So this portal system does not come in contact or communication with the posterior pituitary at all. Only the anterior pituitary is releasing the blood that has this, these tropic hormones in it. So these tropic hormones access the anterior pituitary, and then they can enter the bloodstream and travel to their distant endocrine glands. They will then trigger the release of other hormones out in those various target glands. So I'm going to use one example here, but understand that there are many different trophic hormones and many different endocrine hormones, but I'm going to use one example, which is the thyroid gland, which we'll talk about in the next packet, to kind of explain this hypothalamic pituitary portal system. So the hypothalamus releases a hormone that's called thyrotropin releasing hormone. And that trophic hormone goes into this capillary portal system and makes its way down to the anterior pituitary. Now that trophic hormone is going to then influence the anterior pituitary to secrete another hormone. So this is going to be thyroid releasing hormone. Now that secondary hormone will then enter the bloodstream. It's going to make its way to the thyroid gland, and it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. So as we can see, there are three different hormones that are released by those three different players in this endocrine axis. The hypothalamus releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary releasing thyroid releasing hormone, and then the pituitary itself releasing thyroid hormone, okay? And that is that access or that flow of communication that I mentioned earlier. And we're going to see that with several different endocrine glands, but it's all being orchestrated and all being controlled by the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Okay, now the second part of this is understanding what controls or what regulates this hypothalamic trophic hormone release. So there are three different factors that can control whether or not the trophic hormones are released from the hypothalamus. The first one is neural input. So we've got different nerves that are feeding into the hypothalamus from other areas of the brain. Remember, the hypothalamus is one of our integrating areas of the brain. So certain autonomic neurons can release or control or regulate the release of the hypothalamus to release these hormones. The second factor is hormones. So hormones are also feeding back onto the hypothalamus. So in that example that I talked about with the thyroid hormone will then be released into the body, and it can relay back to the hypothalamus and negatively feed back onto the hypothalamus. So these hormones that are then secreted from our different target endocrine glands will then control or feed back onto the hypothalamus and determine whether tropic hormones are released or not. And then we've got the circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm is basically our sleep-wake cycle. And this controls our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is located in the hypothalamus. And that is basically dictated by the amount of sunlight that is coming into the retina, and determines whether or not we're in a restful, wakeful state, or whether we're in a sleepy or solemn state. So basically, whether we're up and alert or whether we're sleepy and tired is dictated by hormones, but also by the amount of light that's coming into the retina. And then those signals can then be fed back onto the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which will then dictate how much hormones the hypothalamus is releasing. Okay, and this is what controls certain seasonal events of the body. So this is kind of like the body's internal clock. This is what controls things like the menstrual cycle, and allow that to be on such a timely rhythm, right? Such a timely event that happens every certain amount of days. This also controls things like our sleep-wake cycle during winter, right? This is why we're a little bit more tired or sleepy during the winter and a little bit more restful and wakeful during the summer months, okay? All right, so that is the control or regulation of these various trophic hormones. So here's a really nice flow chart that kind of describes that axis that I keep speaking about, that hypothalamus pituitary endocrine gland axis. So the hypothalamus, which is the master gland, is going to secrete a tropic hormone, and this we can call hormone 1. And that tropic hormone we described as being a hormone that would influence another gland to secrete its hormones. So the tropic hormones, which enter the blood via the portal circulation of the pituitary system, then it makes its way to the anterior pituitary, and that is going to influence the anterior pituitary to secrete tropic hormone number 2. And tropic hormone 2 is then going to leave the anterior pituitary, enter the bloodstream, and make its way to the specific endocrine gland that it is targeting. This can be the thyroid, this can be the adrenals, this can be the gonads, the testes or the ovaries, this can be the pancreas, and it's going to tell that endocrine gland to secrete a third hormone. That third hormone will then be released into the blood, and that will have some sort of target response based upon where that gland is located. Now, the feedback part of this is that the endocrine gland, which secretes the third hormone, can feed back onto the hypothalamus and instruct the hypothalamus to stop secreting tropic hormone number 1. So if there's a high concentration of this third endocrine hormone, that will shut down the production of the first tropic hormone. The second feedback here is that the anterior pituitary hormone, the second tropic hormone, can also feed back onto the hypothalamus. So that second tropic hormone can also shut down release of the first tropic hormone coming from the hypothalamus. And so we call this a short negative feedback loop if it's coming from the anterior pituitary second tropic hormone, or we can call this a long negative feedback loop if this is coming from the third hormone, which is being secreted from the endocrine gland itself. Alrighty, okay. And in that way, the hypothalamus is basically the regulating area of the endocrine system. So all of these hormones cannot be secreted in excess or cannot be secreted in inadequate quantities because the hypothalamus is receiving information about the concentration, about the levels of these hormones in the blood, and it is adjusting how much of that tropic hormone number 1 it secretes in response rather to that information that it's receiving. Alrighty, okay. And now the final part here is that we'll speak about the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is one of the endocrine glands that is located in the brain as well. It's a part of the brainstem region here. It is in control of releasing melatonin, and melatonin is also thought to be involved in the circadian rhythm. So this is why we typically take melatonin to help induce sleep. Melatonin is also released in response to our exposure to sunlight, as I was kind of talking about earlier. So when we're exposed to lots of sunlight, we decrease our melatonin secretion. This helps us to be awake and alert and restful throughout the day. Whereas if we are exposed to lack of sunlight, or in the evening or as it gets darker, we secrete more melatonin as we're not getting enough of that sunlight. And this is what helps us to be more sleepy or tired, or encourages sleep when we don't have exposure to sunlight. It also plays an important role in some of the timing of the seasonal process that I spoke about earlier, the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, the reproductive cycle for males as well, okay?